The demon in the attic.
I've been an exorcist for over a decade. During that time, I've faced countless horrors, like possessions, hauntings, curses, but nothing prepared me for the events of that night.
This is the story I've only told a handful of people. A story I really wish I could forget. It's the closest I've ever come to death, and it just changed the way I look at the darkness we fight. It began with a call from a desperate woman named Evelyn. Her voice on the phone was so shaky, laced with terror. She told me about her teenage son, Daniel, who'd been behaving pretty strangely for weeks. It started with sleepless nights, then unexplained scratches on his body, and finally his voice, sort of like claw low and guttural, uttering words in a language no one could understand. "I don't know what's happening to him," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please just help us." I agreed to meet her the next day, but something in her tone made me uneasy. Cases like this weren't very rare, but the fear in her voice was so palpable. I arrived at their house at dusk. It was an old Victorian-style home, like its once grand facade, now weathered and crumbling. Evelyn greeted me at the door, her face pale and drawn. "Thank you for coming," she said, clutching a rosary in her, trembling hands. She led me inside, and I immediately felt it, the heavy, oppressive energy that clung to the air. The house was eerily silent, except for the faint sound of something like scratching from above. That's been happening for days. Evelyn said, noticing my reaction, it said just coming from the attic. "Where? Ask Daniel now?" "Yeah, I asked." "He's upstairs," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He won to come down. He says it won, so to let him." I climbed the creaking staircase, the temperature dropping with each step. At the end of the hallway was Daniel's door, slightly like ajar. "Daniel." "Yeah," I called softly. No response. Opened the door open and just froze. Daniel was sitting on the floor, his back to me, rocking back and forth. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his hands were clutching at his hair. The whole room was so dark, lit only by the flickering light of a single candle. "Daniel," I said again, stepping inside. "I am here to help." He stopped rocking and turned his head slowly to face me. His eyes were black, like the whites completely gone, and his lips curled into a chilling grin. "You were too late," he said, his voice layered with something like inhuman. I've seen possessions before, but this was different. The entity within Daniel was so powerful, far beyond anything I had encountered. I took a step closer, holding my crucifix in the name of Christ. "I command you to leave this whole boy." Daniel laughed. So, a deep guttural sound that didn't belong to a human. The candle flickered violently and the room grew colder. "You think your faith will save you?" "Oh," the voice snarled. "You don't know what I am." The crucifix in my hand grew so heavy, as if some unseen force was trying to pull it away. The scratching from the attic grew louder, more frantic, as if something was just clawing to get out. "Evelyn," I called over my shoulder. "Oh, what's in the attic?" She didn't try to answer. "Evelyn, I turned to find her standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with terror. It stirred her started. She whispered, "He found something up there, like a box." "What kind of box?" "Yeah," I demanded. I don't know," she said, trembling, "but ever since he opened it, things haven't been exactly the same." I knew I had to confront whatever was in the attic, so leaving Daniel in Evelyn's care, I climbed the narrow staircase to the top floor. The scratching grew louder with each step, accompanied by a low guttural growl that just set my teeth on edge. The attic door was closed, the wood splintered and cracked. I hesitated just for a moment, then pushed it open. The air inside was thick with the stench of decay. In the center of the room was a small wooden box, so its surface covered in strange, arcane symbols. The scratches on the floor led directly to it, as if something had just tried to escape. Hand closer, my heart pounding. As I reached for the box, a force slammed into me, knocking me to the ground. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, swirling and coalescing into a shape, a monstrous figure with glowing red eyes and jagged claws. "Shouldn't you come here?" It growled, its voice reverberating through the whole room. Gripping my crucifix, I began to recite the exorcism rites. The creature howled in rage, the shadows lashing out like whips, tearing at my clothes and like skin.
The box began to shake violently. Its lid cracking open from within a black swirling mist began to rise. And I realized with horror that the entity wasn't he just possessing Daniel. So, Soka, it was bound to this box and I had disturbed it.
The force of this anger was overwhelming. My vision blurred as the shadows closed in, and I felt like my strength waning. Then I remembered the vial of holy water in my pocket with my last ounce of strength. I just hurled it at the box. The glass shattered and the water sizzled as it touched the surface. The creature let out a deafening roar, its form dissolving into smoke as the box was consumed by a brilliant white light. When the light faded, the attic was just silent. I staggered back downstairs to find Daniel lying unconscious in his mother's sand arms. His eyes were no longer black, his face no longer twisted. He was just free. Evelyn looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. I didn't reply. I was just too shaken, too aware of how close I had come to death. To this day, I keep a scar on my left hand from that night, just so on a reminder of the shadows that nearly claimed me. I've faced so many battles since, but none as terrifying as the demon in the attic. And I just pray every day that I never face it again. The end. Sort of the faceless man and the abandoned cabin. Some childhood memories are so warm, bathed in the golden glow of nostalgia. Others, like the one I am about to share, are so shadowed, lurking in the recesses of your mind, waiting to resurface in your nightmares. I was 10 years old when it happened, living in a small, sleepy town surrounded by dense woods. My best friend Ethan and I were inseparable, spending our days exploring the forest, imagining like grand adventures among the trees. But one summer day, our innocent games led us to something like neither of us could have imagined. We heard rumors about the old cabin deep in the woods. Kids at school whispered about it, like a place where strange things happened, where people claimed to see shadows moving, even though it was abandoned. Of course, this only really fueled our curiosity. Ethan was the brave one, always pushing us to go further, try something new. It's just an old house, he said, just rolling his eyes at my hesitation. What? So the worst that could happen. That afternoon, armed with flashlights and a pocket knife Ethan had stolen from his dad. So we set out to find the cabin.
The deeper we went into the forest, the darker it seemed to get, even though the sun was still so high in the sky.
The trees grew closer together, their twisted branches forming eerie shapes overhead. It felt as if the forest was alive, just watching us. After what felt like hours, we found it just on a crumbling structure hidden among the trees, its roof sagging and windows shattered. The air around it was unnaturally still, and I couldn't just shake the feeling that we were being watched. Ethan grinned, clearly thrilled by the discovery. He told you it was real. I hesitated, but Ethan was already climbing the rickety steps to the front door. It creaked so loudly as he pushed it open. The inside of the cabin was worse than I'd imagined. Dust covered every surface, cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the smell of damp rot just filled the air. Ethan's flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. "Let's check upstairs," he said, his voice just echoing in the silence. Reluctantly, I followed him up the narrow staircase. The wood groaned under our weight, and every step felt like a kind of warning. At the top of the stairs, we found a small hallway with 3 doors. The first led to an empty bedroom, its walls scratched with marks that looked eerily like claw marks. The second was a bathroom, so its fixtures rusted, and the mirror just cracked. Rich, sort of the third door that made my stomach turn. The door was slightly ajar, and from within came a faint sound, like a low rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on wood. Ethan and I froze, exchanging a nervous glance. "You hear that?" "Yeah," he whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. Ethan pushed the door open, and the tapping just stopped. The room was empty except for an old rocking chair in the corner. It swayed gently back and forth even though there was no wind, so no one to move it. "Probably just the wind," Ethan muttered, though his voice lacked, conviction. When we saw him, at first it was just a shadow in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't a shadow, it was like a man. Claw, or at least something shaped like one. He was tall and thin, with long arms that hung awkwardly at his sides.
His clothes were tattered and his skin was so pale as paper, but his face.
Like there was no face.
No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin where a face should have just been.
I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My body was just frozen with fear.
Ethan grabbed my arm, his nails digging into my skin. "Run," he whispered, his voice just shaking.
Before we could move, the faceless man stepped forward. The way he moved was wrong. Like sort of like cold, jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. So then he raised his hand and pointing directly at us. Back broke the spell. Ethan and I bolted, stumbling down the stairs and out of the cabin. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel him behind us. Feel his gaze like, just like claw or whatever you used to see, like claw boring into the back of my head. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the forest, just gasping for air. After that day, Ethan and I never spoke about the cabin again. We avoided the woods and eventually we just drifted apart. Years later, I returned to the town and decided to visit the forest, so curious to see if the cabin was still there. But when I asked around, no one seemed to know exactly what I was talking about.
The old cabin, one man said frowning, "There hasn't even been a cabin in those woods for decades, burned down long before you were born."
I don't know what I saw that day, or if the cabin was ever real, but sometimes in the dead of night, I dream of that faceless man, his featureless face just staring at me. And when I wake up, I swear I can hear the faint sound of tapping, just like outside my window. The end. In 2004, I embarked on a solo trip through Southeast Asia. My journey was always meant to be a final hara before starting a demanding job back in the US.
For weeks, I wandered through bustling cities, serene temples, and lush jungles, collecting memories that felt like treasures. On the last leg of my trip, I found myself in a small, remote town off the beaten path. It was quaint, surrounded by dense forests, and had a charm that drew me in. But as night approached, I discovered there was only one place to stay, sort of like a decrepit old hotel that looked like it hadn't been touched by time in decades. I didn't have a choice. The next bus out wasn't until morning, and the town had no other kind of accommodations. The receptionist was an elderly man with a gaunt face and unsettlingly pale eyes. His movements were slow, deliberate, and his expression just blank. "Room 304, he said, just sliding a rusted key across the counter.
The room was exactly what I feared. Stale, air-peeling wallpaper and a bed that groaned under the slightest weight. But it was only for one night, and I convinced myself I could endure it. As I unpacked, I noticed something odd. The window in the room didn't open to a view of the street, but instead faced an alley so narrow and so dark, it felt more like a kind of cavern. The shadows outside seemed unnaturally dense, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt so uneasy. That night, I dreamt, or at least I think it was a dream. In the dream, I stood outside the hotel, but the town was unrecognizable. The streets were empty, shrouded in fog, and the buildings seemed warped, their angles impossibly sharp or just crooked. The only sound was the soft tapping of footsteps on the cobblestones, and so soon I saw him. At first he was just a silhouette emerging from the mist, but as he drew closer I saw the really horrifying truth. He was tall and thin, wearing tattered clothes that hung from his frame like a shroud, so bloodstains smeared the fabric, dark and dried, but the most terrifying part was his head, or rather the lack of it. In his hands, he held his severed head by its hair, and the head, SI's just locked onto mine. "You shouldn't have stayed," it whispered, its mouth moving unnaturally as if forming words. It shouldn't be able to speak. So I tried to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The headless man came closer, the severed head's mouth curling into a grotesque kind of grin. The fog thickened, pressing in around me, and the world seemed to warp. I felt cold, like fingers wrapped around my wrist, and the last thing I saw before everything went dark was the head now, inches from my face, whispering words I couldn't just understand. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands were just trembling. It took a moment to convince myself I was back in the hotel, so that it had been nothing more than a nightmare. But as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, something caught my eye on the floor, just beneath the window were muddy footprints, large, bare, and leading directly to my bed. The next morning, I stumbled downstairs, desperate to leave,
The receptionist looked at me with the same blank expression as before, but now there was like a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Sleep well. Yeah, he asked, his voice dripping with something that felt like mockery. I didn't try to reply. I just grabbed my bag and left, just vowing never to return to that cursed town. By the time I boarded my bus out of the village, I felt so weak and feverish. My body ached and my mind was plagued with flashes of the dream, like sort of pariah if it was a dream. When I returned to the US, I was bedridden for days, struck by an illness like no doctor could explain. I couldn't sleep, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, just like Quo the headless man, his severed head watching me with that sinister grin. Eventually, my strength returned, but something inside me had changed. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that town, or why the dream felt so real. But even now, when I pass dark alleys or empty streets, I feel like his whole presence. And sometimes late at night, I hear the faint sound of footsteps, followed by a kind of whisper. You shouldn't have just stayed. The end. Dreams have always been a fleeting mystery to me, sort of fragile as whispers gone by the morning. But one week I had a dream that returned every night, so vivid and unchanging. What started as a comforting escape soon spiraled into something far darker, and by the end, it just left me questioning my grip on reality. Night one, the dream began with a whole garden. I was standing in the middle of a lush, sprawling field of flowers under like a twilight sky. The air smelled faintly of jasmine, and in the distance there was a small gazebo, softly glowing as if lit from within. That's where I actually met him. He stepped out from the gazebo, smiling warmly. He was so tall with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends and eyes that felt like they could see straight through me. You made it, he said, as though he'd been waiting for me. So
I didn't know his name, but in the dream it didn't matter if everything felt right, as if I'd known him like my entire life.
We talked walking through the garden until the stars appeared. I woke up the next morning feeling lighter, the dream lingering in my mind like a really sweet melody. Night two, the dream returned. Exactly the same. The garden, the gazebo, the twilight sky, and so him. This time we talked about our favorite books, our childhood memories, and the places we really wanted to visit. He laughed easily, his voice low and warm. It was the kind of laughter that made me feel so safe. When I woke, I couldn't just stop thinking about him, his smile, his voice, just sort of swore it felt more real than any dream I'd ever had. Night like 3 to 6. Each night the dream unfolded like chapters in a story. We explored the garden together, finding hidden paths and secret ponds. He showed me a small tree house tucked among the branches of an old oak where we spent hours just talking about everything and nothing. By the 4th night, I was so in love. The connection between us felt unshakable and more profound than anything I'd ever really experienced. Even when I woke, I could still feel his hand in mine, like the warmth of his touch lingering on my skin. But as the dreams continued, I began to notice those small, unsettling details. Sometimes his smile faltered just for a second. Other times shadows seemed to linger too long in the corners of the garden, just flickering unnaturally. But his presence always comforted me, and I dismissed these thoughts as tricks of my imagination. So, night 7. The final dream was so different. The garden was darker, the flowers wilted, and the air carried a chill. He was there, waiting for me in the gazebo, but his expression was just somber. I have to tell you something, he said, his voice so heavy. A knot formed in my kind of stomach. This is the last time we'll meet, he continued. Yeah, I wanted to say goodbye. Panic rose in my chest. I reached for his hand, but it was so cold and his grip was faint. Oh, what's happening? He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled. What? A sad, wistful smile, and whispered, oh, thank you for finding me. And then he was gone, the dream dissolving into sort of darkness. The next morning, I woke up feeling hollow. The garden, the laughter, his presence, just thought it was all gone. But the memories remained, and they couldn't shake the feeling that I'd lost something, someone just irreplaceable. Determined to understand, I spent the whole day trying to make sense of it. His face, his voice, sort of they were so clear in my mind.
I began searching online, typing vague descriptions into search engines, hoping for, I didn't even know exactly what. And I found him. His name was like Ethan Myers. The article was dated over a month ago. It described a tragic accident, sort of like a young man who had passed away in a nearby town, leaving behind grieving friends and family. His photo accompanied the article. It was like him, the same dark hair, the same eyes, the same warm smile. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, my mind racing. How could I have dreamt of someone like I'd never met, someone who was already just gone? That night, I lay awake, terrified to close my eyes when sleep finally claimed me. It was just dreamless. Days passed, and though the dreams didn't return, Ethan's presence lingered in my thoughts. I couldn't explain what had happened, but part of me didn't so want to. Somewhere deep down, I felt that in those 7 nights, Ethan had found a way to reach out, sort of like call, perhaps to say goodbye, or perhaps to remind me that love, even fleeting, leaves its mark. Even now, years later, I still think of him, and every time I see a garden bathed in twilight, I wonder if he sat just waiting there, just beyond the edge of sleep. The end,